The moment Martha Dawson stepped out of the general store, she felt every eye in Bodie, California turn toward her belly, and she knew her secret was no longer hers to keep. It was May of 1879, and the spring sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty Main Street. Martha clutched her basket of supplies against her chest, trying to hide what was becoming impossible to conceal. At 22 years old, she had lived in this mining town for 3 years, working as a seamstress and keeping to herself. She had always been respectable, always been careful, until James Hartford came into her life with his promises and his silver tongue. Unmarried and carrying a child, Mrs. Peterson hissed loudly enough for half the street to hear. The shame of it! Martha kept her head down and walked faster, her worn boots kicking up small clouds of dust. Her hands trembled as she gripped the basket handle. James had left for San Francisco 2 months ago, swearing he would send for her once he established himself. The letters had stopped coming 3 weeks later. She had written to the address he gave her, but her correspondence returned unopened. By then, she had missed her monthly courses twice and knew with certainty what was growing inside her. "Women like that should not be allowed to walk among decent folk," another voice called out. Martha felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these people who had once smiled at her and commissioned her needlework. She had sewn christening gowns for their babies, mended their Sunday best, and embroidered their handkerchiefs. Now they looked at her like she carried a disease instead of a child. The boarding house where she rented a small room was at the far end of town, past the saloons and gambling halls that never closed. As she hurried along, a group of miners stepped aside with exaggerated movements, as if proximity to her would taint them. One of them laughed, a cruel sound that made her stomach twist. "Fallen woman," he said, spitting tobacco juice into the street. Martha stumbled, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She caught herself against a hitching post, taking deep breaths of the dusty air. The baby fluttered inside her, a gentle reminder that she was not truly alone. She pressed one hand to her belly, feeling the slight swell that her loosened dresses could no longer hide. A horse whinnied nearby, and Martha looked up to see a cowboy dismounting in front of the saloon. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that curled at his collar. She had seen him around town a few times over the past weeks, always keeping to himself, always watching everything with quiet, observant eyes. He wore dusty leather chaps over his trousers and a faded blue shirt, with a worn hat pulled low over his brow. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Martha saw something unexpected in his gaze. Not judgment, not disgust. Just a steady, measuring look that seemed to see right through her carefully maintained composure to the terror beneath. She quickly looked away and continued toward the boarding house, her heart hammering against her ribs. Mrs. Gilbert, the landlady, was waiting on the front porch, arms crossed over her considerable bosom. Martha's steps slowed as she approached. The older woman's expression told her everything she needed to know before a single word was spoken. "I cannot have you here anymore, Miss Dawson, Mrs. Gilbert said, her voice hard. "This is a respectable establishment." "Please," Martha began, setting down her basket. "I have nowhere else to go. I pay my rent on time. I have never caused any trouble." "You are trouble now," Mrs. Gilbert interrupted. "I have other tenants to think about. Families with children. They do not want their young ones exposed to such immorality." "Where am I supposed to go?" Martha heard the desperation in her own voice and hated it. Mrs. Gilbert's expression softened slightly, but her resolve did not waver. "That is not my concern. You should have thought about consequences before you let yourself be ruined. I want you out by tomorrow morning. If you are not gone by then, I will have the sheriff remove you." The door closed with a decisive thud, leaving Martha standing alone on the porch. She picked up her basket with shaking hands and made her way around to the back stairs that led to her room. Once inside the small space that had been her sanctuary for 3 years, she finally let the tears fall. She sank onto her narrow bed and sobbed into her hands, her whole body shaking with the force of her despair. What was she going to do? She had some money saved, but not enough to travel anywhere or start over. The other boarding houses in town would not take her now. Everyone knew her shame. Martha cried until she had no tears left, then sat staring at the wall as the afternoon light faded. Her room was sparse but clean, with her sewing supplies neatly arranged on a small table by the window. A few dresses hung on pegs, and her other possessions fit easily into a single trunk. 3 years of her life, reduced to objects that could be carried away in minutes. The baby moved again, stronger this time. Martha placed both hands on her belly and whispered, "I am sorry. I am so sorry you will be born into this." She did not sleep that night. Instead, she packed her trunk and organized her belongings, trying to form some kind of plan. By dawn, she was exhausted but no closer to a solution. She carried her trunk down the back stairs, struggling with its weight. Her basket of supplies from the general store sat beside the trunk on the dusty ground behind the boarding house. Martha looked around the alley, feeling lost and small. The morning air was cool, but she knew the day would grow hot quickly. She needed to find shelter before the sun reached its peak. The thought of spending a night outdoors terrified her, especially in her condition. She was trying to figure out how to carry both the trunk and the basket when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw the cowboy from the previous day approaching. Up close, she could see he was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 26 or 27. His face was weathered from sun and wind, with strong features and eyes the color of aged whiskey. "Looks like you could use some help," he said, his voice deep and quiet. Martha stepped back instinctively, clutching her basket. "I am fine, thank you." He looked at the trunk, then at her, one eyebrow raising slightly. "That's so," she felt her cheeks burn. "I do not need charity." "Did not offer charity," he replied. "Offered help. There is a difference." They stood in silence for a moment, measuring each other. Martha wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain what little pride she had left, but the practical reality of her situation could not be ignored. She could not carry the trunk herself, and she had no money to hire someone. "Where are you headed?" he asked when she did not respond. "I do not know," she admitted, the words coming out barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, as if this was the answer he expected. "My name is Paul Anderson. I have a small ranch about 5 miles outside town. Nothing fancy, but it has got a house with a spare room." Martha stared at him, trying to understand what he was offering. "I do not understand. Seems pretty clear to me," Paul said. "You need a place to stay. I have got one. Simple as that." "Why would you help me?" Martha asked suspiciously. "You do not even know me." "Know enough," Paul replied. "Saw how those people treated you yesterday. Figured anyone getting that much scorn from hypocrites probably is not as bad as they are making out." "You know what they say about me," Martha said, lifting her chin despite the shame that burned through her. "It is true. I am with child and unmarried." "Figured as much," Paul said calmly. "Does not change my offer." "I cannot pay you," Martha said. "I have a little money saved, but not much." "Did not ask for payment." Martha felt tears threatening again. "Why are you doing this?" Paul was quiet for a moment, looking past her toward the mountains in the distance. "Had a sister once. She got herself in trouble and my father threw her out, told her she had brought shame on the family. She died that winter, frozen to death in a snowstorm trying to get to the next town. I was just a boy, could not do anything about it then. But I am not a boy anymore. The pain in his voice was old but still raw. Martha felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight band of fear that had gripped her since yesterday. "I am Martha Dawson," she said quietly. "Pleased to meet you properly, Miss Dawson." Paul picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing. "My wagon is around front. Let's get you settled before this town decides to cause more trouble." Martha followed him, still uncertain but with no better options presenting themselves. Paul's wagon was a sturdy buckboard with 2 horses hitched to it. He loaded her trunk into the back and helped her climb onto the seat before handing up her basket. As they drove through town, Martha kept her eyes forward, but she could feel people watching, could hear the whispers. Paul seemed oblivious to it all, guiding the horses with steady hands and an expression that gave nothing away. Once they left Bodie behind, Martha felt some of the tension drain from her shoulders. The landscape was harsh but beautiful, with sagebrush dotting the rocky ground and mountains rising in every direction. The sky stretched overhead, vast and impossibly blue. "How long have you had your ranch?" Martha asked, needing to fill the silence. "About 2 years," Paul replied. "Worked cattle drives before that, saved up enough to buy some land and start my own herd. It is not much yet, maybe 30 head, but it is growing." "Do you live alone?" "Mostly. Got a hand who comes by to help with the heavy work, but he has got his own place, prefers sleeping in his own bed." Martha nodded, looking at the landscape passing by. "I can sew. That is my trade. I can do other things too, cooking, cleaning. If you are offering me shelter, I should contribute somehow." "We will work something out," Paul said. "Main thing is getting you somewhere safe." They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the creaking of the wagon and the steady clip-clop of hooves. Martha studied Paul from the corner of her eye, trying to understand this man who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to form. "You said you saw how they treated me yesterday," Martha said. "Why did you notice? Most people in town seem perfectly happy to look the other way unless it is to judge." Paul considered this. "Spent a lot of years watching people. You learn to see things. Saw you were carrying packages that looked heavy for someone in your condition. Saw you trying to make yourself small. Saw all those righteous folk acting like they never made a mistake in their lives." "I did make a mistake," Martha said, her voice tight. "I trusted someone I should not have. I believed promises that were lies." "Man who left you?" Paul asked. Martha nodded. "James Hartford. He said he loved me. Said we would marry as soon as he made his fortune in San Francisco. I was foolish enough to believe him." "Being trusting is not the same as being foolish," Paul said. "He is the one who should be ashamed, not you." The simple conviction in his voice made Martha's throat tight. She had been carrying so much guilt and shame for months, letting it eat away at her like acid. To hear someone say the fault was not entirely hers felt like a gift she had not earned. Paul's ranch came into view as they crested a small rise. It was modest, as he had said. A simple wooden house with a covered porch, a barn, a corral with horses and cattle grazing in the distance. But it looked solid and well-maintained, and to Martha's eyes, it might as well have been a palace. Paul helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunk inside. The house was clean but sparsely furnished, with the practical air of a place inhabited by a man who spent most of his time working. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, and 2 doors leading to what Martha assumed were bedrooms. "You can have that room," Paul said, gesturing to the door on the left. "It is not much, but the roof does not leak and the bed is decent." Martha opened the door to find a small room with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the grazing land. It was simple, but it was clean and private, and after last night's terror it looked perfect. "Thank you," she said, her voice catching. "I do not know how to repay this kindness." Already told you I am not looking for payment, Paul said. He stood in the doorway, hat in his hands. You are safe here, Miss Dawson. That is all that matters. After Paul left her to settle in, Martha sat on the bed and finally let herself breathe. She was safe. For the first time in weeks, she was safe. The relief was so overwhelming that she bent forward, wrapping her arms around herself, and cried quiet tears of gratitude. Over the next few days, Martha and Paul fell into an easy routine. She woke early and made breakfast, finding that Paul kept his kitchen stocked with basic supplies. He was not much of a cook himself, and he seemed genuinely appreciative of her efforts. She cleaned the house, which needed some attention after months of bachelor neglect, and began mending his work clothes, which were worn but sturdy. Paul worked long hours with his cattle, often riding out before dawn and not returning until dusk. When he was at the house, he was quiet but not unfriendly, answering her questions about the ranch and the land. He never asked her invasive questions about her past or her situation, giving her space to share only what she felt comfortable revealing. On the fourth day, Martha was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she felt dizzy. The world tilted and she grabbed the clothesline for support. Her vision swam, and she felt herself falling. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. Paul lifted her easily, carrying her back into the house and settling her on the sofa in the main room. "When did you last eat?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Martha tried to think. "Breakfast. I had some bread and coffee." "That was 6 hours ago," Paul said. He went to the kitchen and returned with a glass of water and some dried meat and cheese. "You are eating for 2 now. You need more than bread and coffee." Martha accepted the food, feeling embarrassed. "I did not want to take too much. Your supplies." "My supplies are your supplies," Paul said firmly. "You are not a guest here, Miss Dawson. This is your home now for as long as you need it. Understand?" She nodded, biting into the cheese. As she ate, Paul sat in the chair across from her, his expression serious. "We need to talk about practicalities," he said. "The baby will come in 4 or 5 months?" 4, I think, Martha said quietly. "Maybe early October," Paul nodded. "We will need to get supplies. Baby clothes, blankets, other things. And you will need a midwife when the time comes." "I can sew the baby clothes," Martha said, "if you can get me fabric and thread." "That is not a problem," Paul assured her, "but there is something else we need to discuss." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "The town already thinks poorly of you. If they find out you are living here alone with me, unmarried, it will make things worse. They might even cause problems for both of us." Martha felt her stomach drop. "You want me to leave?" "No," Paul said quickly. "That is not what I am saying at all. I am saying we should get married." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Martha stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Married," she finally managed to say. "In name," Paul clarified. "To protect you and the baby, give the child a name and legitimacy. Stop the town from tearing you apart with their gossip." "You cannot want that," Martha protested. "You barely know me. You would tie yourself to me, take on another man's child, all to protect my reputation." "Yes," Paul said simply. "But why?" Martha asked, frustrated. "This makes no sense. You could have any woman. Why saddle yourself with someone like me?" Paul leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression earnest. "I am going to be honest with you, Miss Dawson. I am 30 years old and I am not getting any younger. I have been thinking for a while now that I should probably find a wife, settle down properly. But I am not good with women. Do not know how to court them or say the pretty things they want to hear. The women in town look at me and see a rough cowboy with dirt under his fingernails." "That is not true," Martha said. "It is true enough," Paul continued. You need protection and security. I need someone to share this life with. Seems to me we could help each other. It does not have to be a love match. Just a practical arrangement between two people who could use what the other has to offer. Martha looked down at her hands, her mind racing. It was insane. She barely knew this man, but she was also realistic enough to understand her situation. She was pregnant, penniless, and shunned by society. Paul was offering her safety, legitimacy for her child, and a future that did not involve dying alone in a ditch somewhere. "What would you expect from me?" she asked carefully. "As your wife." Paul seemed to understand what she was really asking. "I would not expect anything you were not willing to give. You would have your own room. I would not force myself on you. You would help with the house, maybe the bookkeeping eventually if you have a head for numbers. But mainly, you would just be here safe. And the baby would be mine in the eyes of the law and everyone in town," Paul said. "I would raise the child as my own. No one would have cause to treat either of you poorly." Martha felt tears welling up again. She seemed to cry at everything lately. "This is too much. You are offering too much." "I am offering what I can give," Paul said. "You do not have to answer right now. Think on it. But think quickly. The longer we wait, the more the town will talk." That night, Martha lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling, her hands resting on her growing belly. The baby was moving more now, little flutters and kicks that reminded her constantly of the life depending on her choices. Paul Anderson was a good man. She had learned that much in just a few days. He was honest, hardworking, and kind in a quiet, unassuming way. He did not make her feel ashamed or dirty. He did not look at her with judgment or pity. He simply treated her like a person deserving of respect. Could she marry him? Could she bind herself to a stranger, even for practical reasons? But was he really a stranger anymore? In 4 days, she had learned the way he took his coffee, that he liked his eggs scrambled, that he always checked the horses before he checked on anything else in the morning. She had seen him gentle a skittish colt with patience and soft words. She had watched him sit on the porch in the evening, looking out over his land with an expression of quiet satisfaction, and he had saved her when no one else would. The next morning, Martha found Paul in the barn, mucking out stalls. She stood in the doorway, gathering her courage. "I have thought about your offer," she said. Paul straightened, setting aside his pitchfork. "And, yes," Martha said, "I will marry you if the offer still stands." Paul's face softened into something that might have been a smile. "It stands. I have conditions," Martha added quickly. "All right. I want to pull my weight. I will not be a burden. I will do whatever work I can to contribute to this ranch." "Agreed. And I want honesty between us. No games, no false pretenses. If something is bothering you, you tell me. I will do the same." "That is fair," Paul said. "And the baby," Martha continued, her voice shaking slightly. "I need to know you meant what you said, that you will not treat the child differently because it is not yours by blood." Paul crossed the distance between them, stopping just in front of her. He was close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "Martha," he said, using her first name for the first time. "Any child raised under my roof will be my child in every way that matters. I give you my word on that." She believed him. Despite all the reasons she had to distrust men and their promises, she believed Paul Anderson. "When do you want to do this?" she asked. "Soon as possible. I will ride into town today, make arrangements with the preacher. We can be married by the end of the week if you are willing." Martha nodded, feeling like she was standing on the edge of a cliff about to jump. "I am willing." Paul reached out and gently took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm. "It is going to be all right, Martha. I promise you that." 3 days later, Martha stood in the small church in Bodie wearing the best dress she owned, with Paul beside her in clean trousers and a pressed shirt. The preacher, Reverend Thompson, had been hesitant at first, especially when he saw Martha's condition. But Paul had spoken to him privately, and whatever was said convinced the Reverend to perform the ceremony. There were no guests, no flowers, no celebration, just two people standing before God and making vows that would bind them together. Martha's voice shook as she repeated the words, "I, Martha, take you, Paul, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part." Paul's voice was steady and sure as he made the same promises. When it came time to kiss, he simply pressed his lips gently to her forehead, a gesture that felt more intimate than a passionate embrace. They signed the marriage certificate, making it official. Martha Dawson became Martha Anderson, and her unborn child gained a father. As they left the church, they encountered a small group of townspeople who had gathered, drawn by curiosity. Martha recognized many of them as the same people who had shunned her just days before. Now they looked confused, unsure how to react to this development. Paul placed a protective hand on the small of Martha's back and guided her to the wagon. He helped her up onto the seat, then climbed up beside her. Before he could pick up the reins, Mrs. Peterson stepped forward, the same woman who had called Martha shameful just days earlier. "Mr. Anderson," she began, her voice uncertain, "I did not realize you and Miss Dawson were courting." "Mrs. Anderson," Paul corrected firmly, "and what my wife and I do is our own business." He drove them out of town without another word, leaving the gossips to make of it what they would. On the ride back to the ranch, Martha felt stunned by the sudden change in her circumstances. She was married. She had a new name, a home, and a husband who sat beside her with calm determination. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You already thanked me," Paul replied. "I know. But I need to say it again. What you did back there, calling me your wife in front of everyone, making it clear that I am under your protection, that meant everything." Paul glanced at her, and for the first time she saw a hint of vulnerability in his expression. "You are my wife now, Martha. That is not just for show. Whatever you need, whatever you or the baby needs, I will provide it. That is my job now." "And what do I give you in return?" Martha asked. "Really? You say this is practical, but I still do not understand what you get out of this arrangement." Paul was quiet for a long moment, the horses plodding steadily along the dusty road. "I get someone to come home to," he finally said. "I get a reason to make this ranch into something more than just a place to work myself to death. I get a chance to be the kind of man my sister needed someone to be for her." Martha felt her heart constrict at the raw honesty in his words. She reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on his thigh. He turned his hand palm up and laced his fingers through hers, and they rode the rest of the way home in companionable silence. Over the following weeks, Martha settled into her new life. She took over the running of the household completely, finding satisfaction in creating order and comfort. She cooked meals that were more elaborate than Paul's usual fare, and she enjoyed watching his appreciation as he ate. She mended not just his clothes but improved them, adding reinforcement to knees and elbows that wore out quickly from ranch work. The house itself began to transform under her care. She made curtains for the windows from fabric Paul brought from town. She organized the cluttered corners and cleaned spaces that had been neglected. She even started a small vegetable garden near the house, planting seeds that Paul had acquired for her. Paul, for his part, continued to treat her with steady kindness and respect. He never pushed her for more than she was willing to give, never demanded anything beyond what they had agreed to. But Martha noticed small changes. He lingered longer over breakfast, talking to her about his plans for the day. He asked her opinion on ranch matters, genuinely listening to her suggestions. He brought her small gifts from town, practical things like sewing needles and fabric, but also occasionally something frivolous like a peppermint stick or a ribbon. Martha's body continued to change as the baby grew. Her belly swelled, her back ached, and she tired more easily. Paul adjusted to her changing needs without her having to ask, taking over heavier chores and insisting she rest more often. One evening in late July, Paul came in from working to find Martha in the kitchen, crying over a pot of stew that had burned while she napped. "I am sorry," she said, wiping at her eyes. "I fell asleep in the chair and the stew burned, and now there is nothing for dinner and I ruined the pot." Paul crossed to her and gently took her shoulders, guiding her away from the stove. "The pot will clean. The stew does not matter. Are you all right?" "I am just so tired all the time," Martha said, more tears spilling over. "And I cry at everything. I burned the stew and I am crying like it is the end of the world. This is ridiculous." "You are growing a person," Paul said reasonably. "That seems like it would be exhausting work." Despite herself, Martha laughed through her tears. "Growing a person. That is one way to put it." Paul smiled, and Martha realized it was the first real smile she had seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger. "Come sit," he said, guiding her to the table. "I will make us some sandwiches. Nothing fancy, but it will fill our bellies." As Martha watched Paul move around the kitchen, assembling a simple meal with capable hands, she felt something shift in her chest. Gratitude had been there from the beginning, but this was something different, something warmer and more complex. She was beginning to care for him. Truly care for him, not just as a benefactor or even a friend, but as a partner. The realization both comforted and terrified her. That night, as she lay in bed, Martha admitted to herself what was happening. She was falling in love with her husband. This man who had married her to save her reputation, who asked nothing of her, who treated her with unfailing kindness. Somewhere along the way, her heart had decided to get involved in what was supposed to be a practical arrangement. The question was, what was she going to do about it? August brought intense heat that made the house stuffy and uncomfortable. Martha moved slowly in the afternoons, fanning herself and trying to stay cool. The baby seemed to dislike the heat as much as she did, kicking and squirming constantly. Paul had hired his occasional hand, a man named Timothy Grant, to help with some repairs on the barn. Martha made lunch for both men, bringing it out to where they worked. As she approached, she heard their conversation. "So you just married her," Timothy was saying, "out of the blue like that." "It is none of your concern," Paul replied evenly. "I am just saying, everyone knows that baby is not yours. You really willing to raise another man's get?" There was a pause, then the sound of wood hitting wood as Paul set down whatever he was holding. "That is my wife you are talking about," Paul said, his voice dangerous in its quiet intensity. "And that baby will be my child. If you have got a problem with that, you can collect your pay and leave." "Hey, I did not mean any offense," Timothy said quickly. "Just surprised is all." "Be less surprised and more focused on your work," Paul said. Martha backed away quietly, returning to the house with the lunch basket. She set it on the table, her hands shaking. Paul had defended her. More than that, he had claimed both her and the baby as his own, not out of obligation but with genuine conviction. When the men came in for lunch, Paul looked at her with concern. "You all right? You look pale." "Just the heat," Martha said, though it was not entirely true. After Timothy left for the day, Paul found Martha sitting on the porch trying to catch whatever breeze might stir. "I heard you earlier," she admitted, "when Timothy was asking about our marriage." Paul settled into the chair beside her, his expression unreadable. Should not have been running his mouth. You defended me, Martha said softly. Of course I did. You are my wife. Paul, Martha began, then hesitated. This started as a practical arrangement. You have done more than anyone could expect, but I need you to know that I see it. I see everything you do, every kindness, every protection. It is not going unnoticed or unappreciated. Paul looked at her, his brown eyes serious. Martha, when I married you, I meant those vows, all of them. I know how it started, but to me, this is a real marriage. You are not an obligation or a burden. You are my wife, and I aim to be a proper husband to you. What does that mean? Martha asked, her heart beating faster. Paul reached over and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. It means I care about you. Not just about keeping you safe, but about you. Your happiness matters to me. Your comfort matters to me. And that baby you are carrying is already mine in my heart, regardless of who fathered it. Martha felt tears welling up again, but these were different. These were tears of something that felt dangerously close to joy. I care about you too, she whispered. More than I expected to, more than might be wise given how this started. Paul's hand tightened on hers. Nothing unwise about it. Seems to me that is how things are supposed to go between a husband and wife. They sat together in the growing dusk, hands linked, and something unspoken but powerful settled between them. An understanding, a promise of something more than they had originally bargained for. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color on the distant trees. Martha was very pregnant now, moving carefully and tiring easily. The baby seemed to have grown enormous, pressing against her lungs and making it hard to breathe. Paul had become increasingly protective as her due date approached. He insisted she rest frequently, and he had moved her sewing station from the table to a comfortable chair near the window where she could work without straining herself. One afternoon, Martha was embroidering a small blanket for the baby when Paul came in unexpectedly. She looked up, startled. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "Fine," Paul said. "Just needed to check something." But instead of going to whatever he needed to check, he sat down across from her, his hat in his hands. "What is it?" Martha asked, setting aside her sewing. Paul seemed to struggle with his words, which was unusual for him. "I have been thinking," he finally said, "about when the baby comes. About what happens after." "What about it? You are still sleeping in the spare room," Paul said. "Which is fine, that was our agreement, but I have been wondering if maybe, once you have recovered from the birth, you might consider moving into my room. With me." Martha's breath caught. This was the conversation they had been dancing around for weeks now. "As your wife truly," she said, not quite a question. "Only if you want to," Paul said quickly. "I am not trying to pressure you. If you would rather keep things as they are, I can accept that. But Martha, I need you to know that my feelings for you have changed. This stopped being just practical for me some time ago." Martha set aside her embroidery and leaned forward as much as her belly would allow. "When did it change for you?" Paul thought about this. "Remember when you burned the stew and cried? That night I realized I did not just want to protect you. I wanted to make you happy. Wanted to be the reason you smiled. That is when I knew. For me, it was when you called me Mrs. Anderson in town that first time," Martha admitted. "The way you said it with such conviction, like you were daring anyone to challenge it. I think that was when I started falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them. Martha had said it, out loud. She loved him. Paul's expression transformed, hope and wonder mixing with something deeper. He crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level. "Say that again," he said softly. "I love you, Paul Anderson," Martha said, her voice steady now. "I did not plan to. This was supposed to be practical and safe, but you made it impossible not to love you." Paul cupped her face gently in his calloused hands. "I love you too, Martha. I love your strength and your kindness. I love how you cry at everything lately, even though you hate it. I love watching you make this house into a home. I love you." He kissed her then, properly this time. Not the chaste press of lips from their wedding day, but a real kiss full of tenderness and promise. Martha melted into it, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Paul rested his forehead against hers. "After the baby comes," he said, "and you have healed and you are ready, I would very much like for us to be husband and wife in every sense." "I would like that too," Martha said. They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, the baby kicking between them as if to remind them both of its presence. "Hello in there," Paul said softly, placing his hand on Martha's belly. "I am your papa. I know we have not formally met yet, but I am very much looking forward to it." The baby kicked again, right under Paul's palm. Martha laughed, feeling more happiness in that moment than she had thought possible just months ago. The last weeks of September crawled by. Martha was uncomfortable all the time now, unable to find a position that did not hurt. Her ankles swelled, her back ached, and she felt as if the baby might simply split her in two. Paul had brought a midwife out to the ranch, a woman named Mrs. Sullivan, who had delivered half the babies in the county. She had examined Martha and pronounced everything normal, leaving instructions for when the time came. "First babies take their time," she had said. "Could be a few more weeks yet." But on the 2nd of October, Martha woke in the pre-dawn darkness to a sensation like a band tightening around her middle. She lay still for a moment, wondering if she had imagined it. Then it came again, stronger this time. "Paul," she called out. He was beside her in seconds, alert despite the early hour. "What is wrong?" "I think the baby is coming," Martha said, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. Paul's training as a cowboy served him well. He did not panic. Instead, he helped her sit up, asked her clear questions about what she was feeling, and then went into action. He helped her into the main room, made her comfortable on the bed they had prepared for this, and then rode out at breakneck speed to fetch Mrs. Sullivan. By the time he returned with the midwife, Martha's pains had grown much stronger and more frequent. Mrs. Sullivan took one look at her and started giving Paul instructions. "Boil water, lots of it. Get me clean towels. Then you are going to need to leave us to our work." "No," Martha gasped between contractions. "I want him to stay." Mrs. Sullivan looked surprised, but she did not argue. "If that is what you want, but Mr. Anderson, you will need a strong stomach for this." "I have delivered calves," Paul said, taking Martha's hand. "I reckon I can handle a baby." Despite the pain, Martha laughed. Trust Paul to compare childbirth to calving. The next hours were some of the hardest of Martha's life. The pain was overwhelming, crashing over her in waves that left her gasping. But Paul stayed beside her the entire time, letting her grip his hand hard enough to bruise, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement. "You are doing so well," he kept saying. "So strong. Almost there, love." Finally, as the sun reached its peak, Martha felt an overwhelming urge to push. Mrs. Sullivan guided her through it, and with one final Herculean effort the baby slid into the world. For a moment there was silence. Then a cry, thin and reedy but strong, filled the room. "A boy," Mrs. Sullivan announced, wrapping the baby in a clean blanket. "You have a son." She placed the baby in Martha's arms, and Martha looked down at the tiny, red-faced infant with wonder. He was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a shock of dark hair, and lungs that clearly worked very well. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "I am your mama." Paul leaned over, looking at the baby with an expression of absolute awe. "He is perfect," he said hoarsely. "Martha, he is perfect." "Do you want to hold him?" Martha asked. Paul nodded, unable to speak. She placed the baby carefully in his arms, and Paul cradled the infant with surprising gentleness for such a large man. "Hello, son," he said softly. "Welcome home." Martha watched her husband holding her son, claiming him without hesitation or reservation, and felt her heart overflow with love for both of them. Mrs. Sullivan cleaned up and gave Martha instructions for the coming days. "You did well, Mrs. Anderson. Very well. The baby is healthy and you should recover quickly. I will check on you in a few days." After the midwife left, Paul carefully returned the baby to Martha's arms. The infant was sleeping now, exhausted from his journey into the world. "What should we name him?" Martha asked. They had discussed names briefly but had never settled on anything definite. "What about Peter?" Paul suggested. "It was my grandfather's name. He was a good man." "Peter Anderson," Martha tested. "I like it. Peter Paul Anderson. Two biblical names," Paul said with a small smile. "The boy does not stand a chance of being anything but righteous." Martha laughed, then winced as the movement pulled at her sore body. Paul immediately looked concerned. "What do you need?" "Water, food." "Just you," Martha said. "Stay with us." Paul settled onto the bed beside her, careful not to jostle her. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. They sat like that for a long time, a family bound not by blood or obligation, but by choice and love. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings. Peter was a good baby overall, but he had his fussy moments, and Martha was exhausted from the demands of new motherhood. Paul stepped up in ways she had not expected, walking the floor with Peter in the middle of the night when Martha was too tired to even sit up. He changed diapers without complaint, sang off-key lullabies, and looked at his son with such tender love that it made Martha's heart ache. She was recovering well from the birth, regaining her strength day by day. Mrs. Sullivan had pronounced her healing properly and told her she could resume normal activities within another week or two. One evening in late October, after Peter had finally fallen asleep in his cradle, Martha found Paul on the porch. The autumn air was crisp, and stars scattered across the black sky like diamonds. "He is asleep," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "How long do you think we have before he wakes again?" Paul asked with a tired smile. "Maybe 2 hours if we are lucky," Martha replied. They sat in companionable silence, both too tired to talk much. But after a while, Martha reached over and took Paul's hand. "I have been thinking about what we talked about before Peter was born," she said. "About me moving into your room." Paul looked at her, his expression carefully neutral. "And Mrs. Sullivan says I have healed well, that I can resume all normal activities." "Martha, there is no rush," Paul said. "You have been through a lot. If you need more time, that is perfectly fine." "I do not need more time," Martha said, meeting his eyes directly. "I want to be your wife in truth, Paul. I love you and I want us to have a real marriage." She saw him swallow hard, emotion flickering across his face. "Are you certain?" "I am certain," Martha said. "You have been my husband in every way that matters for months now. It is time I was your wife in the same way." Paul stood, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. He kissed her deeply with all the passion he had been holding back for months. Martha responded in kind, her arms wrapping around his neck. "Tonight?" he asked against her lips. "Tonight," she agreed. They went inside together, checking on Peter one more time. The baby slept peacefully in his cradle beside Martha's bed. She gazed down at him for a long moment. "We will hear him if he cries," Paul said softly. Martha nodded, then took Paul's hand and let him lead her to his room. Their room now. What happened next was tender and passionate, an expression of the love they had built over months of quiet partnership. Paul was gentle with her, mindful of her recent ordeal, but there was no mistaking the depth of feeling between them. This was not obligation or practicality. This was love, pure and true. Afterwards, Martha lay in Paul's arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I never thought I would have this," she said quietly. "When James left, when I realized I was pregnant and alone, I thought my life was over. I thought I would die alone and ashamed." Paul's arms tightened around her. "You will never be alone again, I promise you that." "How did I get so lucky," Martha wondered, "to be saved by you of all people?" "I think I am the lucky one," Paul said. "You and Peter gave me a family. Gave me a reason to build something lasting here." Martha lifted her head to look at him. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "I know the feeling," Paul said, brushing her hair back from her face. "But that is what real love is, I think. Scary and wonderful and worth every risk." They fell asleep tangled together, and when Peter woke crying 2 hours later, Paul was the one who got up to bring the baby to Martha for feeding. He settled back into bed beside them, watching as Martha nursed their son, and in that moment, everything felt perfect and right. Winter came to the ranch with snow and cold winds. Paul worked hard to keep the cattle fed and safe from the worst of the weather. Martha kept the house warm and comfortable, and Peter grew rapidly, becoming more alert and interactive. He smiled at them now, especially at Paul, who doted on the boy shamelessly. In December, they made their first trip to Bodie as a complete family. Martha was nervous about facing the townspeople again, but Paul's steady presence gave her courage. The reaction was mixed. Some people still looked at them with judgment, unable or unwilling to forget the scandal. But others, especially those who had gotten to know Paul over the years, greeted them warmly and cooed over baby Peter. Mrs. Peterson, surprisingly, stopped them on the street. "Mrs. Anderson," she said, her tone stiff but not unkind. "I wanted to apologize for my harsh words last spring. I spoke out of turn and judgment. Your son is lovely." Martha was so surprised she almost could not respond. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. That means a great deal." As they continued through town, Martha noticed that people were treating her differently now. She was not the fallen woman anymore. She was Mrs. Paul Anderson, a rancher's wife with a baby on her hip. The change in perspective was both relieving and frustrating. Her circumstances had not changed who she was, but society's view of her had shifted entirely based on her marital status. On the ride home, she mentioned this to Paul. "People are foolish," he said bluntly. "They judge without knowing the full story. But at least now they are treating you and Peter with respect. That is what matters." "Does it bother you?" Martha asked. "Knowing that people know Peter is not yours by blood." Paul glanced at the baby sleeping in Martha's arms. "He is mine in every way that counts. Anyone who wants to argue about blood can answer to me." The fierce protectiveness in his voice made Martha smile. She leaned against his shoulder, feeling safe and loved. Christmas was quiet but joyful. Martha made a special dinner, and Paul surprised her with a gift, a delicate gold locket that had belonged to his mother. "I want you to have it," he said as he fastened it around her neck. "You are family now. You deserve to wear the family treasures." Inside the locket, Paul had placed a tiny lock of Peter's hair. Martha's eyes filled with tears as she looked at it. "It is perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." Paul's gift from Martha was a new shirt she had sewn herself, made from fine fabric she had splurged on. But more than that, she had written him a letter, expressing in words all the feelings she sometimes struggled to speak aloud. Paul read it by the firelight, and when he finished, he pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "You and Peter are the best things that ever happened to me," he said. "I mean that, Martha." "We are very lucky to have you," Martha replied. They put Peter to bed in his cradle, which they had moved into their bedroom, and then spent a long, passionate night together. celebrating their first Christmas as a true family. Spring of 1880 brought new life to the ranch. The cattle had survived the winter well, and Paul's herd was growing. He hired Timothy Grant on full time now, and the two men worked long hours building new corrals and expanding the grazing areas. Martha discovered in April that she was pregnant again. She told Paul one evening after dinner, watching his face carefully for his reaction. "Already," he said, then immediately grinned. "That is wonderful. You are not worried?" Martha asked. "Peter is only 6 months old." "Irish twins," Paul said, pulling her onto his lap. "I have always wanted a big family. If you are happy about it, then I am over the moon." "I am happy," Martha said. "Nervous, but happy. At least this time I know what to expect." Paul kissed her thoroughly. "And this time I will be here from the very beginning. This is our baby, Martha. Not just yours. Ours." Martha felt tears prick her eyes. This pregnancy was so different from the last. Then she had been terrified and alone. Now she was loved and supported with a husband who was genuinely excited about the baby they had created together. Peter continued to grow and thrive. He said his first word in May, "Papa," which made Paul ridiculously proud. Martha pretended to be offended that Mama had not come first, but secretly she loved seeing the bond between her husband and son. By summer, Martha's pregnancy was showing, and she was experiencing the familiar discomforts. But this time, Paul knew what to expect and how to help. He took over more of the heavy household tasks and made sure Martha rested. Timothy, who had warmed up to the family over the past months, sometimes brought his fiddle to the house in the evenings. They would sit on the porch while he played, Paul holding Peter, Martha's hand in his, and the music floating out over the darkening land. "This is a good life," Martha said one such evening. "Best life I could imagine," Paul agreed. Their second child, a daughter they named Mary Ellen, was born in late November. The birth was easier than Peter's had been, and Mary came into the world with a head of dark hair and her father's brown eyes. Paul wept when he held her for the first time, overcome with emotion at this tangible proof of the love he and Martha shared. "She is so tiny," he said in wonder. "Was Peter this small?" "All babies are this small," Martha said, amused despite her exhaustion. Peter, now 14 months old, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would pat her gently and say, "baby," in his toddler voice. Paul and Martha watched their children together and marveled at how much their lives had changed in less than 2 years. The years that followed were full of hard work and simple joys. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Paul proved to be a shrewd businessman, making smart decisions about when to buy and sell cattle. Martha managed the household accounts and proved to have a good head for numbers, just as Paul had hoped. They had 2 more children over the next few years, another son named Thomas in 1882, and a daughter named Sarah in 1884. Their house grew crowded and loud, filled with children's laughter and the organized chaos of family life. Martha sometimes thought back to that terrible day in May of 1879, when she had stood in the street of Bodie, shamed and alone, with no future she could see worth living for. If someone had told her then what her life would become, she never would have believed it. But here she was, surrounded by children who called her Mama, married to a man who loved her completely, living a life that was hard but filled with purpose and joy. Paul proved to be an exceptional father. He was patient with the children's endless questions, gentle when they needed comfort, and firm when discipline was required. He treated Peter exactly the same as his biological children, with no difference in affection or expectation. Peter grew up knowing Paul as his father in every way that mattered, and the question of his parentage rarely came up. One day in the summer of 1885, When Peter was nearly 6 years old, he asked Martha about it directly. "Some boys in town say I am not really Papa's son," he said, his small face troubled. "They say I had a different Papa." Martha's heart clenched. She had known this conversation would come eventually, but she had hoped for a few more years. "Come here, sweetheart," she said, pulling him onto her lap despite his growing size. "That is true. Before I met your Papa, I knew another man. He helped make you, but he left before you were born." "Why did he leave?" Peter asked. "Because he was not ready to be a father," Martha said honestly. "But your Papa, the Papa who raises you and loves you, he chose to be your father. He married me when I was pregnant with you, and he has loved you every day of your life." "Does that make sense?" Peter thought about this seriously. "So Papa chose me?" "Yes," Martha said. "He chose both of us." Peter nodded slowly. "I like being Papa's son." "And he likes being your Papa," Martha assured him. When she told Paul about the conversation that evening, he listened quietly, then went to find Peter, who was playing with Thomas in the yard. "Peter, can I talk to you for a minute?" Paul asked. The boy came over and Paul knelt down so they were at eye level. "Your mama told me what some boys said in town," Paul began. "I want to make sure you understand something. You are my son. Not because of blood, but because I chose you and you are mine. No one can tell you different. Understand?" "Yes, Papa," Peter said. "Good. Now if those boys give you trouble again, you tell me. We will handle it together." Peter hugged his father tightly, and Paul held him close, this boy who had been given to him by chance and circumstance, but who he loved as fiercely as any of his other children. The ranch continued to prosper. By 1886, Paul had expanded his holdings significantly, buying additional land and increasing his herd to over 200 head of cattle. He employed 3 full-time hands now and was considered one of the more successful ranchers in the area. Martha had taken up sewing professionally again, but now by choice rather than necessity. She made dresses for the ladies in town and christening gowns for new babies. The income was not needed, but she enjoyed having her own work, and Paul supported her completely. Their marriage had only grown stronger over the years. They still sometimes disagreed, usually over practical matters like how much to spend on improvements or whether Peter was old enough for certain responsibilities. But they had learned how to argue constructively and always came back together, their love deeper for having weathered the disagreements. Their physical relationship remained passionate. Even after 4 children and years of marriage, Paul could still make Martha's heart race with a single look. They stole moments alone when they could, sneaking away for rides across the property or sitting together on the porch after the children were asleep. "I love you more now than I did the day we married," Paul told her one evening. "How is that possible?" Martha asked. "You barely knew me then." "Exactly," Paul said. "I loved the woman I thought you might be. Now I love the woman you are, the mother to my children, my partner in all things, the person who made this house a home. That love goes so much deeper." Martha kissed him softly. "I feel the same way. You gave me everything when I had nothing. You have given me a life beyond anything I dreamed possible." In the fall of 1886, they received unexpected news. A letter arrived from San Francisco, addressed to Martha. She opened it with trembling hands, recognizing the return address even after all these years. It was from a lawyer, informing her that James Hartford had died of consumption and had left her a small sum of money in his will, along with a letter. Martha stared at the documents for a long time before showing them to Paul. He read everything, his expression unreadable. "What do you want to do?" he asked finally. "I do not know," Martha admitted. "Part of me wants to tear it all up and throw it away. He does not deserve any acknowledgement." "But," Paul prompted gently. "But he did give me Peter, even if he did not mean to," Martha finished. and this money could go toward Peter's future. College maybe, or to help him start out when he is grown. Paul nodded. That seems like a good use for it. Do you want to read his letter? Martha picked up the sealed envelope, feeling its weight. After a long moment, she handed it to Paul. You read it first. Tell me if there is anything in it worth knowing. Paul broke the seal and read silently. When he finished, he looked at Martha with something like pity in his eyes. He expresses regret, Paul said. Says he was young and foolish and scared. Says he tried to find you a few years later but heard you were married. He hopes you are happy and asks forgiveness. Too little, too late, Martha said bitterly. Agreed, Paul said. He fed the letter into the fireplace, where it caught and burned. The money we will keep for Peter. The rest is not worth holding on to. Martha watched the letter burn and felt something in her chest relax. The last tie to her past was gone. She was fully and completely Martha Anderson now, with no shadows hanging over her. That evening, after the children were in bed, Martha and Paul made love with particular intensity, reaffirming their bond and washing away any ghosts that might have been stirred up by the letter. The next decade passed in a blur of activity and growth. The children grew up healthy and strong. Peter proved to be exceptional with horses and took over managing that aspect of the ranch by the time he was 15. Mary was quieter, with a love of books that led to her becoming the teacher's assistant at the small school in Bodie. Thomas was the adventurous one, always getting into scrapes but with a good heart. Sarah was the baby, sweet-natured and doted on by everyone. Paul and Martha grew older together, their hair showing gray, their faces lined with years of sun and laughter. But their love never dimmed. They held hands while walking, still stole kisses in the kitchen, and looked at each other across the dinner table with the same affection they had always shared. By 1895, Peter was 21 and courting a nice girl from town. The idea of him marrying and possibly moving away was both exciting and bittersweet for Martha. He is not really leaving, Paul assured her. He wants to build a house on the north section of property, stay part of the ranch operation. I know, Martha said, but he was my baby first. It is hard to let go. You never really let go, Paul said wisely. You just hold on differently. Peter married his sweetheart, Elizabeth, in the spring of 1896. It was a beautiful ceremony, and Martha cried happy tears watching her firstborn take his vows. Paul stood beside her, his arm around her waist, and she leaned into his strength. After the ceremony, as the celebration continued, Martha found a quiet moment to stand alone and look out over the ranch that had become her home. She thought about the scared, shamed woman she had been 17 years ago and the strong, loved woman she was now. There you are, Paul said, coming to stand beside her. What are you thinking about? About how different my life could have been, Martha said. If you had not offered me that ride out of town, if you had not made your impossible, generous offer. It was not impossible, Paul said. It was the easiest decision I ever made. I saw you needed help and I had help to give. It was more than that, Martha insisted. You gave me everything. A home, a name, a family, love. You gave me a whole life. Paul turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Martha, you need to understand something. You gave me just as much. Before you, this ranch was just a place. You made it a home. You gave me children to raise and a purpose beyond just surviving. You gave me love when I had forgotten what that felt like. We saved each other. Martha looked up at this man who had been her husband for 17 years, who she loved more deeply than she had words to express. We did not we? We did, Paul confirmed. He pulled her into his arms and they stood together watching the sun set over the land they had built together. Around them, their children laughed and celebrated. The ranch spread out in all directions, prosperous and thriving. The life they had created together was messy and chaotic and absolutely perfect. As the years continued to pass, Martha and Paul watched their family grow. Mary married a young lawyer from Bodie in 1899, and they settled in town where he had his practice. Thomas joined the ranch full-time, working alongside his father and brother. Sarah showed an interest in nursing and eventually trained to become a midwife, much like Mrs. Sullivan who had delivered her. Grandchildren began to arrive. Peter and Elizabeth had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Mary and her husband had twin daughters. Thomas married in 1903 and started his family. Sarah, after completing her training, married a doctor she met during her apprenticeship. Paul and Martha found themselves at the center of a large, boisterous family. Their house, which had been expanded twice over the years, filled regularly with children and grandchildren. Sunday dinners became a tradition, with everyone gathering around the huge table Paul had built specifically for these occasions. Martha cooked with her daughters and daughters-in-law, passing down recipes and stories. Paul taught his sons and grandsons about ranching, about integrity, and about treating people with respect. The values they had built their marriage on, they passed to the next generation. One evening in the summer of 1905, as they sat together on the porch watching yet another sunset, Paul took Martha's hand. 26 years, he said. Seems like yesterday and forever ago all at once. Martha squeezed his hand. I was just thinking the same thing. We have been blessed, Paul. More than I ever imagined possible. Any regrets? Paul asked. Martha thought about this seriously. Not about us. Not about this life. My only regret is that I wasted so much time feeling ashamed of Peter's beginning when I should have just felt grateful for his existence. He turned out pretty well, Paul said with a smile. All of them did. Because they had you as a father, Martha said. Because they had us as parents, Paul corrected. We did this together, Martha. Every bit of it. They sat in comfortable silence, their hands linked, as they had been for over a quarter-century. The ranch was quiet at this hour, with just the sounds of cattle lowing in the distance and the wind rustling through the grass. Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you had not stopped to help that desperate pregnant woman all those years ago? Martha asked. Paul considered this. Sometimes. I probably would have stayed a bachelor, worked myself into an early grave, and died alone with nothing but a herd of cattle to show for my years on earth. That is grim, Martha said. It is honest, Paul replied. You gave my life meaning, Martha. You and the children. This family is my legacy. That is worth more than all the cattle and land in the world. Martha leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, still strong even as they both aged. I love you, Paul Anderson. I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Martha Anderson, Paul said. My wife, my partner, the best decision I ever made. They sat together as the stars began to appear, 2 people who had found each other in desperate circumstances and built something beautiful together. Their love story had not started conventionally, but it had endured through years of hard work, commitment, and genuine affection. The town that had once shamed Martha for being unmarried and pregnant had long since changed its tune. The Anderson family was respected, their ranch was successful, and their love was evident to everyone who knew them. Martha had gone from fallen woman to pillar of the community, not through any grand gestures but simply through living her life with dignity and grace. As they finally headed inside for the night, Paul paused at the door and looked back at the land that had been the setting for their life together. No regrets, he said firmly. None at all, Martha agreed. They went inside together, to the home they had built, and the life they had created, hand in hand as they had been from the beginning. The cowboy had claimed her as his wife when the town shamed her, and in doing so, he had given them both everything they needed to build a life filled with love, family, and purpose. Years continued to pass, each one adding to the rich tapestry of their life together. They aged gracefully, supporting each other through the inevitable challenges that came with growing older. When Paul's back began to trouble him from years of hard ranch work, Martha was there with warm compresses and gentle hands. When Martha's eyesight dimmed, making her beloved sewing difficult, Paul sat with her in the evenings reading aloud from books and newspapers. Their love had transformed over the decades from passionate and new to deep and enduring, like a river that had carved its course through stone. They knew each other's thoughts, finished each other's sentences, and moved through their days with the synchronized ease of two people who had become one unit. Peter eventually took over most of the ranch operations, with Thomas as his right hand. Paul remained involved but gradually stepped back, content to let his sons lead. He spent more time with his grandchildren, teaching them to ride and sharing stories of the old days. Martha continued her sewing for as long as she could, but eventually passed her needles and thread to Sarah, who had inherited her mother's skill with fabric. Instead, Martha focused on recording family stories, writing down the history of their ranch and their family for future generations. One afternoon in 1910, as Martha was writing in her journal, she came to the entry about the day Paul had found her behind the boarding house. She read back through her words, remembering that terrified young woman she had been. Paul found her there, tears streaming down her face. "What is wrong?" he asked with concern, settling beside her. "Nothing is wrong," Martha assured him. "I was just reading about the day you saved me, the day you offered to help when no one else would." Paul put his arm around her, pulling her close. "Best day of my life, even though I did not know it then." "You were so calm," Martha remembered. "So matter-of-fact about the whole thing, like offering to marry a pregnant stranger was just a normal Tuesday activity." Paul chuckled. "I did not feel calm inside. I was nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. But you needed someone to be steady, so I tried to be steady." "You have been my rock for 31 years," Martha said, kissing his cheek. "My safe harbor in every storm." "And you have been my heart," Paul replied. "The reason I wake up grateful every morning." They sat together in the afternoon light, two people who had weathered decades together and loved each other more with each passing year. In 1912, Paul became seriously ill with pneumonia. For several terrifying weeks, Martha thought she might lose him. She barely left his side, nursing him with the same fierce determination she had applied to every challenge in their life together. The whole family rallied, taking turns sitting with Paul, praying, hoping. Peter held his father's hand and thanked him for being the best father a man could ask for. Mary read to him from his favorite books. Thomas and Sarah made sure the ranch continued running smoothly so Paul would not worry. Martha was there when the fever finally broke, when Paul's eyes opened clear and focused for the first time in days. "Still here," he said weakly. "Of course you are," Martha said, tears of relief streaming down her face. "You are too stubborn to go anywhere." Paul's recovery was slow but steady. By spring, he was back on his feet, though not as strong as before. He tired more easily and needed more rest, but he was alive and he was with them, and that was all that mattered. "You gave me a scare," Martha told him one evening as they sat together. "Gave myself a scare," Paul admitted. "I was not ready to leave you yet. Still have more years to spend with you." "Good," Martha said firmly, "because I am not done with you either." They continued their life together, adjusting to the slower pace that age required but still finding joy in simple things. Morning coffee together on the porch. watching grandchildren play, holding hands during Sunday dinners surrounded by the family they had created. In 1915, on their 36th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered for a celebration. The house was packed with children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. There was food and laughter and music, all the noise and chaos of a large, loving family. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had left, Peter raised a glass in a toast. "To my parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "who showed all of us what real love looks like, what commitment means, what family is built on. Papa, you chose me when you did not have to, and you have been my father in every way that matters. Mama, you have been the heart of this family, holding us all together. We are all here because of you too and the love you share. Thank you." Martha was crying openly, and Paul's eyes were suspiciously bright. They stood together as their family raised glasses and cheered. "Speech," someone called out. Paul cleared his throat. "I am not much for speeches, but I will say this. Your mother and I built something here that we hope will last for generations. This ranch, yes, but more than that. A family built on love and respect and hard work. You are all proof that good things can come from unlikely beginnings. Take care of each other. Love fiercely. And remember that family is not just about blood. It is about choice and commitment and showing up every day." More cheers. Martha added her own words. "When I was at my lowest, when I had nothing and no one, your father gave me everything. He gave me a name, a home, children, and love beyond measure. Every day since then has been a gift. You are all gifts. This family is my greatest joy and my proudest achievement. Love each other, support each other, and never forget that redemption is always possible. Second chances are real. I am living proof." The celebration continued late into the night, with laughter and music filling the house. Martha and Paul sat at the center of it all, surrounded by the evidence of their love made manifest in all these people. As they finally prepared for bed that night, exhausted but happy, Paul helped Martha with the buttons on her dress as he had done thousands of times before. 36 years, Martha mused. Where did the time go? Into this, Paul said, gesturing vaguely at the house, the ranch, the family. Into building something that will last. We did well, Martha said. We did better than well, Paul corrected. We did extraordinary. They climbed into bed together, bodies fitting together with the ease of long practice. Martha rested her head on Paul's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I love you, she whispered. I love you too, Paul replied. Always have, always will. They drifted off to sleep together, as they had done for over 3 decades. Two people who had found each other in impossible circumstances and created a love story for the ages. The years that remained to them were good ones. They continued to age together, continuing to support each other, continuing to love each other with the depth that only decades of shared life can create. They saw more grandchildren and great-grandchildren born. They watched their ranch continue to thrive under Peter's capable management. They remained at the heart of their family, the foundation upon which everyone else stood. When Paul finally passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1920, at the age of 70, Martha grieved deeply, but was comforted by the knowledge that they had been blessed with 41 years together. Years that had been full of love and purpose and meaning. She lived for 3 more years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, continuing to be the heart of the family Paul had called her. She told stories about Paul, about their life together, about the day he had saved her and changed both their destinies. When Martha died in the autumn of 1923, at the age of 66, she was laid to rest beside Paul on a hillside overlooking the ranch they had built together. Their graves stood side by side, just as they had stood side by side in life, united in death as they had been united in marriage. On Martha's gravestone, beneath her name and dates, was a simple inscription chosen by her children. She was shamed by the world. He called her his wife. Together they built a love that conquered all. And beneath Paul's name, he saw a woman in need and gave her everything. A true husband, father, and man of honor. The ranch continued through the generations, passed down from Peter to his children and beyond. The Anderson name became synonymous with integrity and hard work in that part of California. And always, at the foundation of it all, was the story of Paul and Martha, the cowboy and the shamed woman who had found each other and created something beautiful together. Their love story was told and retold, becoming family legend. How Paul had seen Martha at her lowest moment and offered her salvation without asking anything in return. How Martha had taken that chance and transformed herself from a frightened, pregnant girl into the strong matriarch of a large family. How they had fallen in love despite the practical beginning of their marriage. How they had built a life together that stood as proof that redemption was real, that second chances existed, and that true love could triumph over any obstacle. The house they had shared still stood decades later, expanded and updated but essentially the same. The porch where they had spent countless evenings still provided a view of the mountains and grazing land. And on quiet nights, family members who sat there swore they could feel the presence of Paul and Martha, still watching over the legacy they had created together. Their story became more than just family history. It became a reminder that kindness matters, that choosing to help someone in need can change everything, and that love can grow in the most unlikely circumstances. It reminded generations that followed that everyone deserves a second chance, that shame should not be permanent, and that one person's compassion can alter the course of multiple lives. Paul and Martha Anderson had started with nothing but each other and built an empire of love, family, and purpose. Their marriage, which began as a practical arrangement to save a desperate woman, became one of the great love stories of their time. Not because it was easy or perfect, but because it was real, honest, and enduring. And so the story ended where it began, in the small town of Bodie, California, but now the ending was one of triumph rather than shame. The woman the town had scorned had become its most respected matriarch. The cowboy who had taken a chance on her had gained everything worth having. And the family they created together stood as living testimony to the power of compassion, commitment, and love. Their love story proved that endings are really just new beginnings, that the darkest moments can give way to the brightest futures, and that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. The town had shamed her for being unmarried and pregnant. The cowboy said, "Now you are my wife." And together, they created a forever that outlasted them both.